What's cracking, everybody? My name is Zach Moss. Today I'm here to do the impossible task, which is to piece Mayor Pete's foreign policy together. The reason why this is impossible? Well, because he doesn't exactly say his foreign policy. So it's my job to try to fit all the pieces of the puzzle together for you guys. You're welcome in advance. Now, you might be wondering, why is this important to me? Well, fun fact, you might care about having, universal health care. So your grandma or your parents or you don't die because you can't get medical treatment because you can't pay the bills. Also on top of that, if you care about universal college education, it's also very important. The way that this is correlated to that is the fact that the United States, as of 2019, spends $700 billion on the US military. Also, just by the way, just because we spend more money on the US military doesn't mean we're keeping the troops more safe. We're actually having them become more involved in operations overseas, which is putting their lives at risk. If you don't believe me, how many countries do you think the United States is currently in fighting quote unquote terror? And that includes military bases, training other troops, combat deployments, and drone strikes. What do you think? 1, 2, 3, 4 places max we are at. What do you think? You ready for this? 80. According to Brown University, who studies where the United States military is currently setting operations, we are involved in 80 different countries. Let me ask you a question. Do you think someone from Arkansas should be fighting overseas for individuals in Turkey and Cameroon and Somalia and Libya and Tunisia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Mali, so on and so forth? I don't think so. Now, you might be wondering, well, hold on a second. If we're not fighting people overseas, then who's going to be doing it? Maybe the 194 other countries inside the world? That would be a good start. My point is this. This is important. What we do with the lives and what we do with the resources is very relevant to you. And now I want to talk about the foreign policy of a presidential candidate because they might be changing your lives and my lives for the better or worse. So let's jump right into it. Here is Mayor Pete's foreign policy according to his website. So he starts off by saying, quote, security means a foreign policy that puts the values, goals, and national security interests of American citizens above personal political interests. That's exceptionally vague, I'm not gonna lie. Normally, they would have a very vague statement followed up by some sort of policy substance, but to be brutally honest, he doesn't have anything. Not one single bit of substance in this entire paragraph. Also, I include all my sources in the description box below, so if you wanna check out his website, go for it. The most notable thing here is at the very bottom where he says he wants to reverse, quote, the rise of authoritarianism abroad while revitalizing democratic capitalism and our democracy at home. Now, I can't exactly tell you what that means, but I can tell you what questions we should follow up with, and I can also tell you what happened when other presidential candidates had said similar things. Maybe a good question to follow up would be like, how do you stop authoritarianism while promoting democracy and capitalism inside the United States? Think about it. Hold on a second. We are going to stop an authoritarian regime and somehow that helps our capitalism? So it's like we topple them and it helps us? In terms of capitalism and democracy, how does that work out? Now, I'm not saying that he has anything kind of sinister planned. I'm just saying that this is a very questionable aspect of his foreign policy, to say the very least. Now, I've heard this before, and I thought for a second, wait a second. Who also said that they're trying to stop authoritarianism while promoting capitalism and democracy? Who said that? Oh, that's right. So check this article out. It's by the Council on Foreign Relations, and it is a credible source, and it lists the 6 reasons the US gave for invading Iraq. As you see here, 2 of the reasons why we invaded Iraq was apparently because of Iraq's lack of democracy and the example a free and democratic Iraq would set for authoritarian regimes in the region. So we're saying, hey guys, we're gonna invade for democracy and we're gonna set an example for other authoritarian regimes, and that somehow is not related or is related to US capitalism. This was a question at the time because they didn't say it was for US capitalism, but we all knew it was for oil, right? Now, I'm not saying that he supports a war in Iraq because he's on record saying it was a disastrous policy. What I am saying is that he's so overwhelmingly vague that some people might compare him to President Bush unless he specifies what exactly he means. Another question I would have is, how exactly is he going to reverse authoritarianism? Because he's been on record already saying that he would isolate authoritarian regimes. And so is he supposed to isolate them, and that's how he's reversing authoritarianism abroad? And by isolating them, he's promoting capitalism, democracy? I don't know. I am coming up with examples as to what he could possibly mean because he doesn't say otherwise. Here's another questionable statement that he has. During his speech recently, as a matter of fact, which was June 11th, 2019, so it was relatively recent, in Bloomington, Indiana, he says, quote, "The world needs an America free from entrapment and endless war and prepared to focus on future threats." The primary emphasis here should be on future threats because he doesn't say what this entails, but here are some questions that we would be able to ask him. What would your preventative strategy be to counter threats that have not yet happened? The presidents from 9/11 all the way up to this point have utilized something called the authorization for the use of military force, which allows a president to expand their military presence overseas. He actually went on record in that same speech saying that he doesn't support that law. He says, quote, "After 9/11, Congress passed and President George W. Bush signed into law an authorization for the use of military force to eliminate the threat posed by al-Qaeda and to attack the Taliban in Afghanistan. The law was barely 2 pages long, yet it has been used for 2 decades to wage wars and launch military strikes from the mountains of Hindu Kush to the African Sahel." I believe that's how you say that. So what is his alternative? How is he going to counter future threats in a way that the presidents up to this point haven't done? And that's something that I would love to know, because this law is one of the reasons why the US is involved in 80 different countries right now. And if he's trying not to support that law and go somewhere else in the US foreign policy, I'd be up for it, I guess, if I knew what he was trying to say. For all we know, he could say, yeah, let's just nuke him. Of course, he's not going to say that, but I'm just using it as an example. Second question I would ask him. If he does not support the old law, will he cancel military operations that began under that law? I think that's a fair question, right? If all the presidents up to this point since 9/11 have started operations overseas in accordance with that law and he doesn't support that law, is he going to cancel those operations? Is he going to continue with those operations? Because if he continues them, then what's the point of him crafting his own foreign policy if he's just following the footsteps of his predecessors? With Pete up to this point, I can honestly say that I can't really make a prediction for what he'll do, and that's not really a promising quality in a candidate. Fortunately, there is one positive aspect. He said that he is not a fan of going into wars alone. So he says, quote, "The next president must set a high bar on the use of force and an exceedingly high bar on doing so unilaterally. When America acts alone, it can only be because core interests are at stake and because there is no alternative." So unilateral action means the United States is going into a country and attacking them alone. Generally, that is a bad strategy because if stuff goes south, you are left alone. What you want instead is something called multilateral action. That's where if you can convince the UN to get involved and you can convince, say, NATO, those sorts of things where you have multiple countries involved, and so you have more support. And we can guess, and you could try to tell me, which I would appreciate, but again, it's just you assuming and me assuming. So my question for him would be, what conditions would spark unilateral action? Would it be the oil tanker that recently was blown up, apparently by Iran? And a lot of conservatives are thinking that that was a good reason to go invade Iran. Would it be something along the lines of like 9/11? What would it be? Don't know. So next, let's get into what he thinks about nuclear weapons. On Iran, he said that he would be cool with going back to the Iran deal. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. What the Iran deal is that it allows Iran to produce nuclear energy, but not nuclear weapons. That way, if they decided one day, hey, you know what, we want nuclear weapons, it's going to take them months to do so as opposed to days if they weren't a part of the deal. For North Korea, specifically with the nuclear weapons, Mayor Pete says that he would keep sanctions until they make steps to denuclearize. He also says he wants to introduce North Korea into the international community, and he doesn't say how that'll happen and if this includes forgiving North Korea leaders for waging a genocide against their own people. And yes, I'm going to go ahead and call it a genocide because that's what it was. They killed mass numbers of people in their own country. But the fact that he just says, I want to introduce them, well, cool, Trump just did that. So what does that mean? Again, not being a hater, just saying we would like some detail. Next, I want to talk about Mayor Pete's discussion regarding US aid. Mayor Pete thinks that we should focus more on aid and less on military action, specifically in places like Venezuela. So he actually says, in quote, adding, not subtracting to US aid efforts in Central America so that we can better address the crime, corruption, and poverty that contribute to mass migration in the first place. It is a bit funny and odd that he says that we should increase aid to better address corruption. So I studied a little bit into the effects US aid has on other countries. And just let me tell you, just point blankly, aid is only effective if the government is not brutally corrupt. Because if the government is corrupt, the elites pay off everybody that they need to pay off and then pocket the rest of the cash. It's pretty simple, right? Hindsight's like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. Well, yeah, it does make sense because it happens pretty often, as a matter of fact. What you actually need to do is enact what is called a top-down and bottom-up strategy. Essentially, empower the local groups and local organizations first, then allow these groups to participate in the political, economic, and social process with government leaders. In return, people on the top and people on the bottom end up getting funding as a result. So Mayor Pete doesn't actually mention any of this, and he says that investing aid is the solution. Well, it's actually not, and it never has been the solution. It's never really worked. That's actually a classic misconception. It's like an answer someone who didn't really study for the test in this area of study would say, and it really makes me wonder whether either he or his advisors or a combination of the two actually know what the effects aid has, and it's kind of making me wonder if he's going to waste taxpayer dollars or not. This is a red flag. That's all I'm saying right here. Now, let's talk about violent extremism. This is something that I actually really like to study. This is something that's very important to me. This is at the core of my being because I am currently pursuing a PhD and I study international conflict. More specifically, I study extremism. It's kind of my little niche. So when people mention what they would do regarding extremism, I start to get a little, what's the word I'm looking for? A little excited. I'm like, oh yeah, you want to try to stop extremism? Okay, tell me what you're trying to do and let me try to critique it or support you in that process. You get what I'm saying here? So he says, ISIS is not the only group that advances political stances through mass violence. So do white supremacists, terrorists, anti-government militias, and other groups that use form of domestic extremism. Yeah, I mean, that's very vague. There's a lot of things that people have supported and a lot of things that didn't go right. But I am glad that he mentions white supremacists. I don't think that's mentioned too much. And Antifa. Acquiring change in the political process through violence usually ends up with the group that uses that violence. Once they get in power, they typically use violence from that point onwards as well. Even if some of their hearts are in the right place, the fact that they are trying to create political change through violence, in this context, that's a terrible idea. Pete also says that he would focus more resources on countering domestic terrorism while continuing to fight against international and Islamist-inspired violent extremism. Okay, there are many levels to countering extremism. For example, occupying territory, which doesn't work, profiling and conducting searches on susceptible crowds, quote unquote, susceptible crowds, fund other extremists that have less of a track record for violence, increasing rights and freedoms so people who feel disaffected don't feel so driven towards violence, which is generally overseas. Him saying we need to do something about this is very frustrating. There's a whole list of things everybody's already tried. And he's either going to say, hey, we need to occupy more land. And I'll say, you're crazy. Doesn't work. There's a whole book on this. I mentioned it in the description box below. That would be a failure. If he's saying, hey, we need to put cameras in the mosques, which I doubt he's going to say, but that's a typical conservative thing that has been pitched. So I want to bring it up, even though he's not a conservative. Bad idea. One thing that we should say to him is, what specifically are you trying to enact right now? And how do you plan to go about this? Are you going to fund, say, in Egypt or some of those other places? You're going to fund something like the Muslim Brotherhood? The Muslim Brotherhood has had a history several decades ago of violence, but as recently hasn't been as violent as some of the other groups. And there's a lot of intelligence agencies within the United States, particularly with, say, the CIA, that are funding groups like that. When Mayor Pete says, we need to stop this, well, how are you going to stop it, Mayor Pete? How are you going to stop it? The fact that he doesn't say, we are going to stop extremism by, and inserting what it is, for example, hey, we're going to stop extremism abroad by bombing 90% civilians. What is Mayor Pete going to do? Is he going to support that? Is he going to occupy them? Is he going to realize the fact that maybe what we should do is we should try a top down and bottom up approach? Why don't we address the root causes here? Maybe try to have a little bit less corruption. Maybe try to get people a little more politically involved. Maybe try to support groups that aren't as violent. Maybe stop occupying and killing so many people overseas, which has been proven to be more beneficial than anything else. Maybe we should do that, but it doesn't say that. And so it makes me very weary because we've been in so many wars and we're in 80 different countries. This isn't a time to roll the dice on someone is what I'm saying. And I don't mean to go on a full-blown rant here. I'm just saying that this is something that we need to make sure the right leader is going to do something about. Mayor Pete, I will support you if you come out with more policy substance. In the meantime, I can't get with it. I'm gonna be honest, I can't get with it. You're not the guy for me. Some of the other people like Bernie Sanders, what's her face? Tulsi Gabbard, a few others have really come out and started to give a little bit more policy substance. When Mayor Pete decides to live up to that occasion, I'm down. 100% down. Maybe discuss some of the things that he's done in the military and whether that worked or didn't work. We would all very much appreciate that. In the time being though, let me know what you think. Let me know if you're still supporting him, and if so, why. If I missed something, please let me know. Thank you guys very much for listening to this. My rant is over. If you wanted to like, that'd be awesome. Or subscribe, or reach out to me on Twitter at ZachMoss6. Yes, because that is how you end a video.